They weren't passive victims of history. Native tribes fought back with defenses so unconventional that invaders never saw them coming. The surprising part? These tactics raise a question historians rarely dare to ask out loud. Native American warriors didn't just fight battles, they turned the entire landscape into their secret weapon. While European armies marched in neat formations across open fields, expecting their enemies to meet them head-on like gentlemen, tribal warriors had other plans. They knew every rock, every tree, every hidden trail for miles around their territory. Dense forests became natural mazes where warriors could appear and disappear like ghosts. Rocky outcroppings provided perfect cover for archers who could pick off invaders one by one. But here's the clever part. Many tribes deliberately chose battle sites that looked welcoming to their enemies. A nice flat valley might seem like the perfect place for a quick fight until warriors started raining arrows down from the surrounding hills. Chiefs understood something that took European military academies decades to figure out. Terrain matters more than numbers. 100 warriors positioned correctly could devastate an army of thousands. They let invading forces march deep into valleys, getting them tired and stretched out, then attack from multiple elevated positions simultaneously. Rivers played a huge role too. Warriors knew exactly where to cross, which currents were strongest, and where the water was too deep for horses. After a successful ambush, they could vanish across waterways that their enemies couldn't navigate safely. By the time confused soldiers figured out how to follow, the warriors had melted back into familiar wilderness. Trail knowledge was like having a secret highway system. What looked like impenetrable forest to outsiders was actually crisscrossed with hunting paths, game trails, and hidden routes between villages. Warriors could strike fast, disappear completely, then show up miles away before their enemies even realized they'd escaped. The real genius was how chiefs adapted their strategies on the fly. European commanders relied on predetermined battle plans and rigid formations. Native leaders watched the land, the weather, and their opponents, then changed tactics instantly. If the wind shifted and smoke from cooking fires might give away their position, they'd relocate. If morning fog provided extra cover, they'd advance the attack by hours. Some tribes even modified the landscape itself before battles. They'd block certain trails with fallen trees, creating natural funnels that forced enemies into kill zones. Others would set small grass fires to create smoke screens or clear sight lines for their archers. What made this approach so devastating was the psychological effect on invading forces. Soldiers never knew when the quiet forest around them might explode into violence. Every shadow could hide a warrior. Every hill might conceal an ambush. The constant tension wore down morale faster than any direct assault. This mastery of terrain gave tribes something that superior numbers and better weapons couldn't match: control. They decided when fights happened, where they happened, and how they unfolded. But controlling the battlefield was only the beginning of their tactical brilliance. The way they moved during combat would prove even more revolutionary. Fighting in straight lines worked great for European armies. Neat rows, organized columns, predictable movements. Native warriors looked at this approach and basically said, "Thanks, but no thanks." Their battle formations looked more like controlled chaos, and that's exactly what made them so deadly. Traditional military thinking demanded soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder, march in formation, and fire volleys on command. Warriors threw this playbook out the window. They fought in loose, scattered groups that could spread out across huge areas or bunch together in seconds. Think of it like trying to hit a flock of birds with a rock versus trying to hit a brick wall. The wall's easier to hit, but those birds? Good luck. This flexibility created a nightmare for invading forces armed with muskets and cannons. Heavy artillery worked best against packed targets. When warriors scattered into small mobile units, cannonballs just whistled through empty space. Musket volleys that should have mowed down entire ranks instead found nothing but air and trees. But here's where things get really interesting. Warriors didn't just scatter randomly. They moved in coordinated swirling patterns that looked confusing from the outside, but made perfect sense to them. One moment they'd be attacking from the left flank, the next they'd vanish completely, only to pop up behind enemy lines minutes later. European commanders trained for decades to handle predictable battlefield movements suddenly found themselves playing a completely different game. The psychological impact was brutal. Soldiers expected to face an enemy they could see, count, and target. Instead, they faced shadows that materialized from nowhere, struck hard, then melted back into the landscape. Panic spread faster than wildfire through rigid formations when warriors attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. What really drove enemies crazy was the split and merge tactic. Warriors would appear as one large group, then suddenly break into dozens of smaller units moving in different directions. Enemy commanders had no idea where to focus their fire or how many fighters they actually faced. By the time they figured out a response, those small units had already regrouped somewhere else entirely. This approach kept warrior casualties surprisingly low. Rigid European formations could be surrounded and trapped, leading to devastating losses. Flexible warrior groups simply flowed around threats like water around rocks. When things got too hot, they didn't stand and die for honor. They disappeared and lived to fight another battle. The really clever part? These formations required no complex drilling or years of training. Warriors grew up hunting in groups, moving quietly through forests, coordinating without words. Their natural skills translated perfectly to battlefield tactics that left professional soldiers completely baffled. Smart chiefs realized something important. You don't beat a bigger, better-equipped army by fighting their way. But coordinating these fluid formations required something most armies never mastered: instant communication across chaotic battlefields. When bullets are flying and chaos erupts everywhere, how do you tell your warriors what to do next? Native American chiefs had this problem figured out long before walkie-talkies existed. Mirror signals became their secret weapon on bright days. Chiefs would angle polished pieces of metal or obsidian to catch sunlight, then flash-coded messages across entire battlefields. One flash meant advance. 3 quick flashes signaled retreat. Enemy soldiers had no clue what those dancing light beams meant, but every warrior knew exactly when to strike or fall back. But what about cloudy days or dense forest battles? That's where eagle bone whistles saved lives. These weren't just random toots and squeaks. Each whistle pattern carried specific meaning. A long blast followed by 2 short ones might mean circle left. 4 quick bursts could signal attack now. The weird part is that enemies often mistook these sounds for actual bird calls, never realizing they were hearing military commands. Then there were the colorful flags and banners that whipped through combat zones. Warriors needed to identify friends from foes when everything moved fast and dust clouds blocked vision. Different colored feathers, painted designs, and fabric strips told stories instantly. Red meant one tribe, blue another. Specific patterns indicated rank or battle group. Makes sense, right? You can't accidentally shoot your own people if you know what to look for. War cries served double duty as both communication and psychological warfare. What sounded like terrifying screams to enemies actually contained coded information for fellow warriors. A rising howl might mean flanking maneuver starting. A sharp, choppy yell could signal prepare for charge. Enemy soldiers just heard bone-chilling noise that made their hands shake, but tribal fighters heard clear battlefield instructions. Let's not forget the sneaky communication tricks that really messed with invaders' heads. Some clever chiefs learned to copy European bugle calls and drum patterns. Well, they'd use these stolen signals to send false commands to enemy troops. Imagine being a colonial soldier, hearing what sounds like your captain's retreat signal, only to discover later that a Native American chief was the one giving orders. Talk about psychological warfare at its finest. The most brilliant aspect was how these communication methods worked together seamlessly. Mirror flashes coordinated with whistle calls. War cries reinforced flag signals. Everything connected like pieces of a well-oiled machine, creating information networks that covered miles of territory. European armies relied on shouted orders and simple horn blasts that everyone could hear and understand. Native tribes built communication systems so sophisticated that enemies couldn't break the code even when they figured out something was happening. And the weird part is that speed mattered just as much as secrecy. These weren't slow, complicated message systems. Chiefs needed split-second communication that could change battle outcomes instantly. But having great communication meant nothing without the lightning-fast tactics that made these messages devastatingly effective in actual combat. When most armies planned their attacks, they'd march in neat formations during daylight hours like they were heading to a parade. Native warriors, they had a completely different playbook. Dawn raids became their signature move, and for good reason. Nothing ruins an enemy's morning coffee quite like war whoops echoing through the mist while you're still half asleep in your bedroll. The timing wasn't random either. Those pre-dawn hours hit when human alertness naturally drops to its lowest point. Guards would be drowsy, fires would be dying down, and most importantly, the invading forces would be psychologically unprepared for violence. Well, imagine waking up to arrows whistling past your tent instead of birds chirping. But here's where it gets really clever. These weren't just hit-and-run tactics. Warriors spent days, sometimes weeks, studying their targets. They'd note patrol patterns, identify weak spots in camp defenses, and map out multiple escape routes through terrain they knew like the back of their hand. The actual attack might last 20 minutes, but the preparation could take a month. The disappearing act afterward was pure artistry. While European forces expected enemies to stick around and fight it out toe-to-toe, native warriors would strike hard and vanish into landscapes that might as well have been another planet to their pursuers. Dense forests, rocky canyons, and swamplands became their highways to safety. Then there's the reward system that kept morale sky high. Successful raiders earned respect, better weapons, and sometimes leadership positions within their tribes. Bravery in battle wasn't just honored with ceremonies, it opened doors to political influence and social status. Makes sense when you think about it. Why wouldn't you reward the people keeping your community safe? And here's the part that really frustrated colonial forces. Retreat wasn't considered cowardly. If a raid went sideways or reinforcements showed up unexpectedly, warriors would disappear without hesitation. They understood something that traditional armies often forgot. Living to fight another day beats dying for pride. This practical approach meant veteran warriors could accumulate years of experience instead of becoming casualties in their first major engagement. The psychological impact was devastating too. Colonial settlements never knew when the next attack might come. Every sunrise brought anxiety. Every unusual sound in the pre-dawn darkness sent hearts racing. Sleep became a luxury that many couldn't afford. What made these tactics even more effective was their unpredictability. Some raids targeted supplies, others focused on livestock, and occasionally they'd strike at military outposts. The variety kept enemies guessing and prevented them from developing effective countermeasures. But dawn raids and quick strikes were just part of a larger psychological war being waged. The mental games native warriors played went far beyond simple surprise attacks, tapping into fears that ran much deeper than anyone expected. War isn't just about weapons and tactics. The mind game matters just as much, and Native American tribes mastered psychological warfare like nobody's business. They understood something that modern military strategists still teach today. Fear can defeat an enemy before the first arrow flies. Scalping gets talked about a lot in old Western movies, but here's what most people don't know. It wasn't just some brutal practice done in the heat of battle. Scalping served multiple strategic purposes that went way beyond violence. When warriors returned home with scalps, entire villages would celebrate and display them prominently. Think of it as the ultimate trophy case, except these trophies sent a crystal clear message to anyone thinking about attacking. This is what happens to our enemies. The psychological impact was huge. Enemy forces would hear stories about scalping and literally freeze up before battles even started. Some European soldiers wrote letters home describing how terrified they were, not of dying, but of what might happen if they were captured alive. That fear made them hesitate, make mistakes, and sometimes retreat when they should have pressed forward. Then there's the spiritual warfare aspect that really messed with invaders' heads. Ghost dances and ceremonial rituals before battles weren't just for the warriors' benefit. These ceremonies were performed where enemies could see or hear them, creating an atmosphere of supernatural dread. European soldiers already far from home and dealing with unfamiliar territory would witness these intense spiritual displays and start questioning everything they thought they knew about their opponents. War cries deserve their own mention here. Those blood-curdling whoops and shouts weren't random noise. Different sounds meant different things, and experienced warriors could coordinate attacks using specific vocal signals. But the real genius was how these sounds affected enemy morale. Imagine you're a colonial soldier, already nervous, and suddenly the forest erupts with otherworldly screams from every direction. Your hands start shaking, your aim gets worse, and your decision-making goes right out the window. Let's not forget the disinformation campaigns that would make modern spy agencies proud. Some tribes deliberately spread false information about their numbers, locations, and battle plans. They'd plant fake evidence, create misleading trails, and even use captured uniforms to confuse enemy scouts. One particularly clever trick involved mimicking enemy signals and drum patterns to send opposing forces marching in the wrong direction or walking straight into ambushes. The beauty of psychological warfare was its efficiency. Why lose warriors in direct combat when you can make enemies defeat themselves through fear and confusion? Smart chiefs knew that a terrified enemy makes poor decisions, fights badly, and often retreats without putting up much resistance. But even the most effective mind games needed backup plans. When psychological tactics weren't enough to win battles, tribes had to rely on superior equipment and weapons adapted specifically for their fighting style. When European settlers showed up with their fancy muskets and horses, most people figured the native tribes were doomed. After all, how could bows and arrows compete with gunpowder? Well, that's where everyone got it wrong. Native warriors weren't stuck in the past. They were incredibly fast learners. Within months of first contact, tribes were figuring out how to get their hands on these new weapons. They'd trade furs, food, even prisoners for muskets. Some warriors got creative and just took them from fallen enemies. Makes sense, right? But here's the fascinating part. Traditional weapons didn't disappear overnight. A skilled warrior with a bow could shoot 6 arrows in the time it took a European to reload his musket once. Those tomahawks? Perfect for close combat when your gun turned into an expensive club. War clubs made from hardwood could crack skulls through metal helmets. These weren't primitive tools. They were precision instruments of war. Then there's the whole horse situation. Before Europeans arrived, native tribes fought on foot. But once they saw mounted cavalry in action, game changer. Plains tribes like the Comanche became some of the world's best horsemen within a single generation. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, something that took European cavalry years to master. The armor game was equally clever. Forget those heavy metal suits that made European knights move like rusty robots. Native warriors crafted lightweight protection that actually worked. Thick bison hide could stop arrows cold and even deflect musket balls if the angle was right. Some tribes layered wooden slats between leather sheets, creating flexible armor that moved with the warrior's body. Let's not forget the genius of adaptation. When tribes couldn't get enough muskets through trade, they learned metalworking. Using iron from broken tools and weapons, skilled craftsmen hammered out spear points, arrowheads, and even crude firearms. European blacksmiths weren't the only ones who understood metal. The weird part is how quickly this knowledge spread. A new weapon or technique discovered by one tribe could travel hundreds of miles through trade networks within months. Warriors shared tactical innovations like modern soldiers sharing battlefield intel. If the Cherokee figured out a better way to use cavalry charges, the Creek Nation might be using it by next spring. Defense wasn't just about individual protection either. Tribes started building fortified positions using European-style earthworks combined with traditional palisades. These weren't the simple wooden fences you might expect. They were sophisticated defensive systems that could withstand cannon fire. What made this adaptation so effective wasn't just copying European methods. Native warriors took the best parts and mixed them with their own proven techniques. A warrior might carry a musket, traditional bow, tomahawk, and war club all at once. Talk about being prepared for anything. But having better weapons was only part of the equation. The real power came from how tribes worked together. When you're facing an enemy with better weapons and more soldiers, smart leaders know one thing: you can't win alone. Native tribes understood this lesson long before European military academies started teaching it. The answer wasn't bigger armies or fancier guns. It was something much more powerful. Picture a single Cherokee messenger riding through dangerous territory, carrying a sacred peace pipe wrapped in bear fur. This wasn't just some casual diplomatic visit. These messengers risked their lives traveling between tribes that had been enemies for generations. But when foreign invaders threatened everyone's land, old feuds suddenly seemed pretty stupid. The Iroquois Confederacy proved how devastating unity could be. 6 different tribes with their own languages and customs created a military alliance that dominated the Northeast for centuries. Makes sense, right? Instead of fighting each other, they combined their best warriors into coordinated armies that could strike multiple targets simultaneously. But here's where it gets really interesting. Chiefs didn't just merge their forces and hope for the best. They held massive war councils where leaders from different tribes could volunteer their strategies. A Mohawk chief might suggest using river routes for surprise attacks, while a Seneca leader offered knowledge about enemy supply lines. This wasn't top-down military command, it was collaborative warfare that kept everyone invested in victory. Well, the results speak for themselves. United tribal coalitions forced European invaders to completely abandon their traditional battle formations. French and British commanders found themselves copying native tactics just to survive. The students had become the teachers, and the lesson was brutal. Then there's the psychological impact nobody talks about. When European scouts reported facing not just one tribe, but 3 or 4 working together, panic spread through colonial settlements faster than wildfire. Suddenly, what seemed like manageable resistance became an existential threat that required massive military resources. These alliances weren't temporary either. Some coalitions held their ground for decades against overwhelming odds. The Creek Confederacy controlled huge territories in the southeast by uniting dozens of smaller tribes under shared leadership. Their combined knowledge of local terrain and coordinated battle strategies made them nearly impossible to defeat in their homeland. And the weird part is how flexible these alliances remained. Unlike rigid European military hierarchies, tribal coalitions could adapt their leadership structure based on specific threats. If they faced a river battle, the tribe with the best canoe warriors took charge. Forest ambush, the group with superior woodland skills called the shots. Chiefs also discovered that allowing warrior volunteers to choose their own battle roles dramatically improved morale. Nobody fights harder than someone who picked their own mission. This volunteer system created elite fighting units within the larger alliance that specialized in everything from reconnaissance to siege warfare. The lesson here cuts straight to the bone. Individual brilliance means nothing without collective strength. These tribal alliances transformed scattered resistance into coordinated campaigns that changed the entire course of colonial expansion across North America.